limits. Also, you have a deep water tuna halibut fishery. The halibut fishery, since they went to deep water regulations, they're going out 30, 40 miles, mostly from the larger ports. Yaquina Bay, Tillamook has a lot of, Depot Bay has a lot of traffic, Columbia River has a lot of traffic. But these deep water fisheries for halibut start in May, and they'll run oddly on specific days over the weeks. And maybe depending on the catch limits, they may run into July or August. Excuse me. Once they started that, all the fishermen decided, well, we can go out another 20, 30 miles and catch tuna. And so starting in June, there's a significant amount of activity for offshore tuna fishing with sports boats. My last couple years ago, talking with the folks at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, their creel surveys showed that they had nearly 9,000 landings on the Oregon coast of tuna fishermen going offshore in 21-foot to whatever size charter boats or other larger boats. So it's turned into a significant fishery. As times change, as the different fisheries, that salmon went pretty dry for a while. Now the salmon limits are back up, and there's just a lot of activity starting here in about June out through the coastal waters. And we still maintain the restriction process on them as well if we get tidal influence that creates rough bar conditions. As Captain said, operational issues, it also depends on the density that you have of the windmill devices. I kind of picture it kind of like towing through a minefield if they're fairly tight. You like to hold when you're towing a specific position and a course to where there's less wear and tear on your equipment, there's less wear and tear on you, your crew, and also the vessel you're towing. Commercial wise, they have pink shrimp fisheries sometimes down off the Cape Blanco in the wintertime. Spent a lot of significant times of my life down there getting beat up. You'll have midwater trawl. There's all kinds of activities within that zone from the beach out to 40 miles. Another thing with the I see that would be an issue is with the influx of more vessel operation. You probably have larger tender vessels like they do down in the Gulf. You're going to have all those things. It'd put a strain on our assets, especially due to resource hour restrictions that we have on the vessels. To continually bring in and have us conducting what I call our AAA towing that we do on recreational boats. But I think that there would have to be more infrastructure on the part of the companies that are doing this to have their own support vessels that are able to handle that part, because a lot of it would just be out of our towing capabilities, really, if they're much more than 70 or 80 foot, if 100 foot. 47-footer is going to be quite strapped at being able to handle that. And then that would also bring an increased load on our manpower assets. And, so it'd be a push for us. We would have to add a significant amount more of infrastructure. And I think that there would have to be some sharing of that or just taking over it. In between my job, active duty, and here I worked up on the oil fields in Prudhoe Bay. I was the marine specialist for the oil spill response organization up there. And we had to do all of our own search and rescue with each other. And with Crowley, tug and barge, we had contracts, but there was no other reliance on anybody else. And I think that would be probably what may have to happen with this. So. That's pretty much everything that I thought about with this, and I'm open for questions now as well.
Well, thank you, Scott and Dan. Excellent presentations. We have about 20 minutes for questions. I'm sure we have many. So As we did before, if you're online, if you could just put your hand up, and if you're in this room, just it seemed to work quite well if you just put your name card vertically. So let's get started with questions. And looks like Brian, you're going to lead off.
Hey, thanks, Master Chief and Captain. I appreciate you. Great stuff, and really what we were looking for. Master Chief, I'm sorry, I lost my mind and called you a warrant officer. I don't know what was wrong with me.
Yeah, if you bump the pay, I'm good at it. I'm fine.
Yeah, I wish, right? I field demotion with a pay raise. I don't understand it, but there you go. Quick question for both of you to maybe just expand what you know. The Coast Guard is recapitalizing its small boats, its cutters, and its aircraft. And I think I'm correct to generally say that the plan that was most recently announced, and of course that can change, was to move to a somewhat smaller total fleet of helicopters, but all MH-60s, which are the medium range helicopters. And I wonder if you have a sense of what that would do to search and rescue operations off the West Coast. And the same general question, Master Chief. I know the motor surf boats are being contracted. I don't know what state of development they're in, but these would be boats to return capability we haven't had in a long time beyond the 47s. And I wonder if you have thoughts about what that capability does or does not bring and where it would be located.
Certainly, I can go first, Admiral. Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about what the future footprint of Coast Guard aviation is going to look like all throughout the United States. A lot of discussion on hub and spoke systems to facilitate maintenance that's out there. Last I've seen, and keep in mind I'm a little dated here. They were looking at potentially shutting down one, possibly two air stations on the West Coast as we go into the transformation from a dual helicopter fleet with H-65s and 60s to a single type helicopter fleet with H-60s. That said, decision had not been made on which air stations they were going to close. But I know the intent was that all of the range rings that those assets would cover would be interlocking. What does that mean for offshore environment? Based on what I saw with locations of where the wind development fields were going to go off of Oregon, as well as California, I don't see a difference really off the California coast as much as what I would off the Oregon coast. And the reason I say that, because if it depends on which air station would be looked at for closure, whether it would increase distances or local proximity to the wind fields up closer to Oregon or Humboldt Bay, kind of Northern California area. I don't know if that answers your question, Admiral.
It does, Scott. I'll just ask you maybe to elaborate a little bit. I think just given the audience, everybody should probably maybe get just a little bit of a difference between the existing 65 and then the 60 in terms of capability. And then I wonder if you have anything additional you'd want to add at this point about the total size that's been announced. I mean, obviously that can change, but I think it is it's down from the current number of helicopters to just 127 nationally. Over.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So what we're looking at, the plan was, as the Admiral stated, we're flipping air stations from H-65 units to H-60 units because the added capability, range, capacity of the helicopters themselves. I mean, we're able to pick up a lot more folks in an H-60. It's our more. I always likened the H-65 to a Mazda Miata and the H-60 to a Ford F-350. I mean, you got a lot more capability to haul a lot more people. You can go a lot further distances. That said, the 65 is a great platform. I've flown both of them most of my time in 60s, but 65 is a great platform. It's limited by range though. And as we get further into the life cycle of the H-65, we're limited in being able to source parts as it is an antiquated aircraft. The H-60, on the other hand, Sikorsky is still continuing to build that platform, not just for the Coast Guard, but for the DoD services as well, which led us to look at the different capacity. That said, when we take away because of the added capacity, we're doing a swap for, it takes about 3 H-60s to equal 5 H-65s. So we're downsizing the numbers of the aircraft that we're going to have in the inventory. We're also looking at, because we won't have as many aircraft in the inventory, how many places can we support, what makes sense from a resource perspective for siting of these more capable assets. Keep in mind there's fewer assets, but more capable assets where the Coast Guard continues to be capable of responding to its statutory missions there. I know the last I've seen the on slide decks, like I said, I'm dated here, but was looking at Port Angeles, North Bend, and potentially Humboldt Bay for future down the road. Obviously, congressional, you got to get the buy-in at all levels for these closures, but those were the three that were being looked at as potential sites up and down the West Coast.
Okay, thank you. Next question will be from Robert Shepard, followed by Mike Conroy. Robert?
Thanks for your presentations, guys. You both talked about some of the challenges of the weather and the particularly high sea states and those effects. I'm wondering if you can talk about the seasonality of those storms and whether you guys typically get a good chunk of the year that you don't have such bad weather, or is it pretty consistent? And I'm looking at it from the perspective of how developers and operators would plan their campaigns around, obviously good weather windows. How big are those windows? Do they have a good chunk of time that they can get certain work done?
Dan, I mean,
Yeah, I'll
you hit on it earlier.
I'll
Yeah.
grab it. Yeah, basically when we get into a summertime jet stream, kind of like we have now, or starting now, we get stuff more out of the westerly area, out of the southwest area, rain showers. We start getting into a summer mode. We're starting right now this year. Of course, it depends on, you can sit there and look at all the models that the weathermen do and stuff like that. But I kind of plan like coming into May, you start getting a lot better weather. You'll have good weather. No, those earth-shattering storms you won't see during the summertime. They'll start picking up probably late September. From my recollection clear back to 1977, we'd had some pretty significant storms in October. Like the one I mentioned where we had the gust of 114 miles an hour was in October. Right around Veterans Day too. And it'll persist, clear up all through the winter. Normally there's a little bit of gap where you get some nicer weather about January, but it's very slim. It gets real cold, but you just watch the weather reports, and it's one system after another coming out of the Gulf of Alaska from about October clear until now. You'll get 1 or 2 days, where you don't have any rain, and it'll pour for a week, and the wind will blow. I have these mysterious chairs on my porch here because I'm living over at the coast that they move from one end of the deck to the other in the middle of the night, and it gets blowing hard. Even my lights on my garage door turn sideways. I've got the flat ones; they'll spin. The wind will blow them. It gets humping. And then you can look at the captain of the port should have records here of how many times they've actually physically closed the bar during those time periods. So that would be one area that I would take get a hold of the district and try to get that information from. As far as the bar restriction part of that, when I first took the job as a boating safety specialist, we put cameras and stuff up and down the whole coast to monitor and stuff, and the Weather Service got involved. And the National Weather Service in Portland, they broadcast all of our bar conditions and restrictions on their website. They keep very, very tight record of all that stuff, and they can, kind of give you some feedback on particular times of the year or whatever, or storms that have come through, or they can give you a fairly decent data set on tracking those storms, because that's what they do for a living.
I would throw in there too. I mean, the winter months are always the more challenging, certainly months. I mean, from about October until the end of March, that's the snottiest weather for the Pacific Northwest. You're going to have the most challenging of our search and rescue cases are going to go out in that time frame. That said, I know I talked earlier that you're competing with a lot of other things. And in the Pacific Northwest, the beautiful months are certainly the summer months, and that's when everybody comes out to play. So then you get the recreational boater traffic, you get the moms and pops, you get the pleasure craft, you get commercial fishermen going out there, and everything happens, which increases the mission load and the fatigue in the summer months. Now, while the risk, I would say, if you're comparing apples to apples here, is not as great. The workload is much higher in the summertime, but the risk is way higher in the wintertime. So either way, one's going to be a risky scenario. If you're doing work in the wintertime, you're certainly throwing the risk way up there. But if you're doing work in the summertime, now there's a lot of competing interest for those resources.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I guess this question is for Dan. You had implied that there's a likelihood that the 47-foot vessels will be replaced by larger ones?
The 47s now are coming up over 20 years of service. Matter of fact, just before I retired in 2000, I think I had the number 10 hull out of the production model at Tillamook. They've been operating pretty faithfully as you can get for something that's that technologically involved and stuff. I'm showing my old guard thing because I drove 36 footers and 44 footers, but they're starting to get to the end of their service life. The one thing that has happened is we had 4 52 footers here in the Pacific Northwest, and they were solid steel double enders, and those things were the workhorse, especially offshore. They had a 750-mile range. They could take 30-foot breaking seas. I mean, they're workhorses, but they were 70 years old. So they've decommissioned all 4 of those. There's a process going on where they're looking at possibly replacing them with something new, more modern. I think the last that I heard, they're looking at 6 to 8 hulls instead of the 4. But budgets, I'm not going to hang my hat on it to see it in the next, if it does happen in the next 6 to 8 years.
Okay, thanks. No, I was just curious from a port perspective, if Coast Guard has a ship in Humboldt that takes up 45 feet or 47 foot worth of berthing, replacing it with a larger vessel, has the availability of space within the port been a consideration, especially if you're considering and assuming that the offshore wind industry is going to have vessels in there, you're squeezing more, very limited space.
Yeah, well, I think they're going to put another fast response cutter in there to replace the 110. But looking at that, those are new. They were just coming out when I retired my second time. I'm looking at it. Their maximum sea capability is 29 feet, and they don't have surf capabilities. So the bars are breaking. Those FRCs aren't going out.
Thank you. Let's see. The next question is David, and then Jeremy, and then Brian. Start with Stephen Joyner.
You acknowledged me, so I put it down. So one thing I've asked many times and have not received an answer, who's going to provide security for these things if they're many miles offshore? There are a lot of bad actors moving around. Will that be the Coast Guard's job, and how will you do that? And then I'll date myself, the Columbus Day storm, 1962, the mother of all.
I was there too. I think I was like 3 years old or something like that. 4. Yeah, security wise, I have no idea at my point. I'm dated too a little bit with it, but we're too busy doing living marine resource enforcement and drug enforcement and immigration enforcement. Adding another layer onto that, especially when the area is so broad and we're so thin. I frankly don't see us trying to pick that up, but stranger things have happened.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, obviously you're talking coastal security and you're talking if it's a national security issue, the Coast Guard would certainly be weighing in on it. Do we have the resources out there right now? You would be robbing from Peter to pay Paul at the end of the day, moving. And that's obviously based on the commandant's direction. It's based on, the administration's direction on where those resources are going. But you don't have enough. You don't have enough Schlitz right now to go around. You'd be taken from one place and put in another if you detach Coast Guard assets for any kind of security purpose there.
Okay, we'll finish with 3 more questions. We'll lead off with David Checkley, followed by Jeremy Firestone. Then I'll have a short question. And I'm sure when we're finished, we'll have questions that we'll send you by email as well. Okay, David.
Yeah, this is not directly a Coast Guard question, but you referred to vessels that are drifting. And I'm wondering if you envision a scenario in which emergency response towing vessels would be useful in regards to wind farms off of the West Coast, such as exist in Nia Bay and off the West Coast of Vancouver Island, to go out and rescue drifting vessels.
Yeah, it's going to depend on the size and the frequency that it happens. I know that there's going to be more of a workload with those vessels, but normally what I've seen, because I worked for 2 years between jobs up there on the slope, and the maintenance and stuff, though, they can't afford to be down. So they really, really, really hop on that. They're going to need to have something. I look at more like the oil fields down in the Gulf and stuff like that, where they have their crew boats, their assist boats, stuff like that. I'm pretty sure that they're going to have something like that within this scenario, just for support of construction and maintenance. And more than likely, I would probably see them doing something with that, to where they're training their crews a little bit more on, or bringing people in that are towboat certified, things like that, more out of the commercial realm.
I think that ties back to the whole industry's duty of care for their folks too. If they're developing something and pushing this industry out, I think it's only a wise CEO that's going to think about, what do I need to do if I do have these limitations? How can I best ensure that we're properly caring for those members that are going out there and doing the work? And that includes those dedicated emergency response and rescue vessels, including probably a towing capability, and then the training and knowledge of those members that are hired to do that safely.
Thank you.
Yeah, Captain Jackson, you mentioned that the conditions on the Pacific, and you mentioned the North Sea. So we know there's a lot of wind turbines there. What, and this could be for both of you, what have we learned both about air and ship rescue in the North Sea that might be valuable in the Pacific?
I know, I downloaded some stuff here. Let me go through my answers. I know talking about safety, helicopter lanes. Let me go. I looked at some of the stuff that our neighbors across the sea are doing here. Bear with me while I'm scrolling through. Had to do with public policy and stuff here. The UK requires hoist zones and design input from aviation SAR teams. That's one of the things that they're doing, requiring by regulation. Germany is mandating radar modeling and emergency access corridors for helicopters coming in and out of the wind fields. And then Norway enforces air access planning into their offshore energy regulation. So a lot of policy and regulation that builds in safety or response capability for rescue assets that are servicing the North Sea.
Yeah, from my knowledge with that, because I'm pretty limited on that. I know though that like the RNLI, Royal National Lifeboat Institution, that they're the ones that have all the search and rescue small boat vessels. Also, when you get into the Netherlands, Germany, and all those places, the majority of those institutions are privately funded through donations. And I don't think that they get that much into assisting those offshore resources like that. They're providing their own backup, their own search and rescue assets, unless it's, all of a sudden it's just a barn burner where you've got people in the water or whatever. The RNL respond to those things, and so the other agencies, but I don't think that they're getting involved in it on a a non-emergent SAR basis.
I can send a link later, probably via email, if you give me probably to Maddie, I can send you that for just, but it really gives it's a link of a study that's was done overseas, overview of different national requirements, whether Denmark, Germany, UK, or Norway, as they're really kind of at the forefront of this.
Yeah, thank you for that. And if it goes to Maddie, we'll all get it.
Okay.
One final question. In your first slide, the first bullet, challenges with West Coast wind farms, you mentioned the long offshore distances. And it seems that when you look at all practical sites, the final site ends up being the furthest, most remote site for a lot of factors, fisheries, but other factors. Is there a limit to how far offshore current assets can handle? And are there mitigating, if you had improved assets, what would they be in order to mitigate risk if these installations are far offshore?
I can tell you the helicopter range, the H60 are max typically. I know the book says 300, but we always build in a little extra. And so 270 is typically what we're looking at. Depends on what the weather looks like. If the weather is really snotty, you may pull the load back to 250 because that means I've got to get back to shore, someplace I've got to land in foul weather conditions with enough of a reserve to where I'm not putting my crew at risk. So a way to say it depends. It depends on, but we have max distances based on these assets, the H60, planning purposes, our crews, if they were going out beyond 270, I was doing double looks as the CO, looking at the risk going, okay, that's at the max range. What are our different options for recovery for that asset? That said, that's from launching from the air station. Now, I'm going to always look at, do I need to refuel and top off? If I'm going offshore due west of Humboldt Bay, I'm probably going to send an aircraft and refuel it at Humboldt Bay where I get the shortest straight line distance. But that's if I've got time. Is speed of necessity? Then I could go 270 out and then get to a closer spot here on land. I may be able to go further than 270 as long as my distance back to land or getting safely on deck is a shorter distance. So typically a planning range of 540 nautical miles. You pencil mark the distances in there, but you need to build in time for the crew to come to a hover, safely do a risk assessment brief as they get on scene. That's all hampered by the weather conditions on scene too, whether they can even get into that site. I'm always thinking of, the things you'd be thinking about in a wind turbine environment. I'd have to have all those wind turbines stopped. And then again, there's other mitigating factors that I'd be concerned with too. Other than taking the downwind or the radar reflective stuff, all those things built in with what's the weather conditions on scene, what's the distance between those windmills we talked about earlier as well. If I've got 1,000 different radar returns out there, I'm having to go scroll all the way in on my radar, and the closer you get on radar, the less because you're having such a short distance for a radar to go out and come back to you, you're not getting as accurate a picture, and you can't widen your radar. You're narrowing it down to where you get a quick return on radars. There's some limitations with radar paints, but getting into radar terminology, the closer you get, you're going to get to a point where you're not going to have accuracies. And I'm flying in between these big towering structures with a helicopter. You can imagine I'd be sucking the seat cushion up in my rear end if I was doing that, especially in bad weather conditions. I don't know. I kind of went off on a tangent with you. The bottom line, it depends. I've got to have a place to get the helicopter back to once we launch out and recover back in. And I've got to safely get down. If it's really snotty weather and they go in the clouds, I've got to get a place where I can do an instrument approach and get them down to terra firma safely.
Yeah, and he's got to deal with gravity. Basically for us, the boats will handle it, the endurances, but of course you look at the 47, 50 miles offshore, there's that fudge factor in there to where they have enough fuel to get out and back. When you start towing, you start draining more fuel if that's what you're doing. The FRCs, they've got a 2,500 mile range, but they've got a 5-day endurance limit. And that's where, when it comes to boats, is where you're going to have your most issues, is the crew. I'm not 100% service connected disabled for nothing. You get beat up. You get beat up bad, and the recovery time is, especially if it's in nasty weather. I've been out down off Cape Blanco in 30-foot seas on a 52-footer as a crewman, break the tow line loose 3 times, pick it up in the same place we got it the time before. You're getting pounded, at least with the aircraft guys. I always used to tell my crew, they're going to be sitting back in another 45 minutes at the air station sipping coffee, and we're out here for the next 12 hours getting pounded into the bottom of the ocean. So that's the difference between.
Respect the hell out of you guys, Dan, more than you'll ever know. Respect
yeah.
Dan, Scott, thank you so much for speaking with us today. This is exactly, I think, what the committee was looking for in terms of the feedback of folks who have actually gone out and done it. So, hey, thanks for your service to our country. Thanks for helping us out yet again. Semper Paratus, guys.
Yep. Thanks for the opportunity.
Admiral.
I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Great
and we
seeing you
have
again.
your contacts. We'll certainly be back with more questions. So thanks. Okay, our next agenda item is the tribal liaison engagement. So I'll pass it along to Maddie to take care of that one.
Sure. So part of this study will include some input from a tribal liaison group, which is a non-committal group of really any interested member that can speak for, represent, or has any input from different tribes along the West Coast, not necessarily federally recognized tribe, but any tribal group or nation from California, Oregon, or Washington. And there's going to be some limited opportunities for the committee and these tribal liaisons to engage with each other. So we wanted to start the process early and have invited some of the liaisons that we've been in touch with so far. Last week, we held some organizational meetings and we've been in touch with a few groups. So a couple of people were able to join us today. So we wanted to give them a chance to introduce themselves to you all and provide any information that they feel comfortable sharing with you guys. And then we can go from there. So I'll let them introduce themselves. We can start with Isabel was able to join us in person. I don't know if you'd like to start, Isabel.
Thank you. I'll raise my hand for the people online that can see me in the room. My name is Isabel Irad. I'm not a tribal member. I'm a tribal staff member for Blue Lake Rancheria, a federally recognized tribe in Northern California near Humboldt Bay. It's one of 3 Wiyot area tribes. So our ancestral territory includes Humboldt Bay, but there's also 2 other tribes in that area. And I work on offshore wind engagement for the tribes. So for the past year and a half, working with state and federal agencies on the topics that were discussed in the last, tribal treaty rights panel on government to government consultation, public comment on offshore wind strategies, and we're continuing to engage with the Port of Humboldt and the Port of Long Beach on their port redevelopment plans. So I wanted to show that, we're here to engage as best we can. And some of the work with the state and federal agencies has been to ask for studies such as this to give more baseline information about the impacts of offshore wind to our community. So thank you, Madeline, for the invitation. I work remotely for the tribe, so this is a good opportunity to see you all in person. And I hope that many of you get a chance to go up to Humboldt again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Isabel. Kevin, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Hello. My name is Kevin McKernan. I work for the Yurok tribe. I'm their marine director. Formed a marine department. Fisheries department.
Oh, Kevin, you're freezing on our end a bit. I don't know. Well, oh yeah, maybe if you turn off video, it would move a little easier. Perfect.
Yeah, my. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Kevin McKernan, Yurok tribe, marine department. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Hannah, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. My name is Hannah Tennant, and I'm a climate change specialist for the federally recognized Hoh tribe, whose territory is on the west coast of Washington. I'm not a tribal member, I'm a staff member. And I guess as far as this group goes, we're unsure yet if we'll be participating in the tribal liaison group or if we'll spend more time in a listening capacity, but certainly throughout the recent years have been paying attention and following the development of offshore wind on the coast of Washington. Thank you.
Awesome. Were there any other members or tribal liaisons or interested tribal liaisons that I might have missed that want to say anything? Okay. In that case, so those are some of our tribal liaisons. Unfortunately, we haven't had our first meeting yet, and this was a little short notice for them, so a lot of them weren't able to join us, but we're hoping to provide more opportunities in the future for not just introductions, but chances for you guys to engage with one another. So if that's something you're interested in, or if there's anything specific in terms of engagement, that is the committee or any interested tribal liaisons that are here, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to be go between you guys and get as much for you guys as I can. Thanks.
Okay, that wraps up our section. Next would be the break, unless you have something, Carolyn, that you would like to fill in. All right, we have an extended break then until 3:20. It gives us all a chance to talk about what we've heard this morning. And we'll meet back here and we'll hear from Ed Harland, a final speaker from the California Energy Commission. Thank you. From the California Energy Commission, Ed is an energy and policy planner working on offshore renewable energy development off the coast of California. Ed? And we do have your slides up on the screen.
Great, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eli Harland, and I supervise a team at the California Energy Commission that's responsible for assessing and planning offshore renewable energy. Appreciate the invitation to present to the committee this afternoon, and I look forward to the Q&A as well as the forthcoming report that the committee is working on. Just a little bit of background about myself. I've been working on offshore energy issues since I was an advisor to CEC Commissioner Karen Douglas in around 2016. The first meeting I actually attended on offshore wind issues was with commercial fishermen on the Central Coast. And from that meeting, I understood right away that the ocean and coastal environment is complex and regarded for much more than its economic and energy value. My work has also included working with the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Pacific Office, as well as understanding concerns from coastal communities and ocean users and tribal governments. Working with an array of state agencies that are focused on offshore issues, I helped the state engage with the federal government on the leasing process for the first 5 leases that have been executed off the coast of California. Today, I'm going to present some of the CEC's key work and summarizing that prepared material with my own perspective. I'll mainly discuss 2 California statutory requirements, but first I wanted to just reorient folks to California's clean energy goals. So next slide, please. So a main driver of focusing on potential offshore renewable energy is California's clean energy goals. Senate Bill 100, which is a state policy that California supply all retail sales of electricity with renewable and clean energy resources by 2045. The CEC, which I work for, is overseen by 5 appointed commissioners, and the Energy Commission has some key roles in achieving this policy. The first report that was prepared pursuant to SB 100, it found that in order to meet the 2045 clean energy goal, California is going to need to add thousands of megawatts of clean energy capacity on an annual basis, at almost a rate of 5 to 8 times more per year than California's added in past years. This includes resources like small and large-scale solar, geothermal, wind energy on land and in the ocean, energy storage, as well as energy efficiency. So next slide, please. So the first CEC requirement that I'll discuss is Senate Bill 525, which was passed in 2021 by the state legislature and took effect in January 2022. Next slide. Assembly Bill 525, or AB 525, it's a very detailed law with an array of requirements placed on the CEC. The law can be thought of as unique because the state doesn't typically have a carve out for one resource from the portfolio of resources being pursued to meet clean energy goals. And AB 525 doesn't necessarily carve out offshore wind, but it does place a lot of attention on developing a strategy to do so. A required first step was for the CEC to establish offshore wind megawatt planning goals for purposes of developing the strategic plan. Within the design of the legislation, these goals are important because they are foundational to many of the other requirements. As shown on the slide there, these are the major topic areas that AB 525 directed the CEC to work on. In addition to delivering on these requirements, we were also required to work with federal, state, and local agencies, as well as engage and consult with tribal governments. Additionally, engagement with fishing organizations, both commercial and recreational, environmental organizations, environmental justice organizations, and local communities was also required. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the planning goals are the first step required within AB 525. And as shown on the slide, the CEC set the goals at 2 to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 25 gigawatts by 2045. A gigawatt is equal to 1,000 megawatts. So if anyone's familiar with the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, that power plant is 2.2 gigawatts or 2,200 megawatts. Just doing some rough math, if each of the offshore wind turbines that is installed is a 15 megawatt turbine, that would mean 1,666 turbines to reach the 25 gigawatt planning goal. I point that out because each of these are large pieces of infrastructure on their own. So 1,666 is a significant number. In addition to setting planning goals, the CEC was required to prepare 2 additional work products that would ultimately inform the final strategic plan. Those are a preliminary assessment of the economic benefits of offshore wind, as well as a permitting roadmap for offshore wind. Next slide, please. So getting into some of those requirements and what's included in the plan that was prepared. The map shown here, which may be hard to see on your end, but it does show the BOEM wind energy areas. These are the areas that have been leased. Those are in blue, as well as the areas that the CEC analyzed and ultimately identified as suitable sea space to meet the requirements of AB 525. These areas were identified through a public process and in coordination with state agencies and federal agencies. The CEC was also required to look at potential impacts in these areas and identify solutions to overcome those impacts. I'm going to go into more detail later in the presentation on what we looked for in those impacts and some of the strategies that we identified. And then also, if you're really interested in this information and a lot of the detail that's provided by resource types, I would recommend reading volume 3 of the AB 525 strategic plan. An important note is that these areas are at minimum 20 miles from the shoreline in federal waters. So these sea spaces are not directly cited by the state as well, but rather these would have to be identified through the federal leasing process under Department of Interior and BOEM. Next slide. Another area that we were required to look at is port and waterfront infrastructure upgrades that would be required to support those planning goals. And unlike fixed bottom turbines that have been developed in other countries and being pursued on the East Coast, floating offshore wind turbines need to be developed within the ports and towed out to project areas. So AB 525 required us to look at potential opportunities and constraints as they relate to the sea spaces that were identified. The map that's shown here summarizes the results of that analysis that informed the strategic plan. The map shows ports that could or couldn't meet their port requirement needs of floating offshore wind development. While there are many locations shown here, the AB 525 strategic plan didn't go into great depth into these, and the infrastructure upgrades that would be required are substantial. The areas that are the polygons that are shown here in green identify the more suitable ports to meet the needs of offshore wind. And the areas that are shown in yellow are moderately suitable, and the ones that are shown in red were found to be not suitable. Building upon this assessment that was done for Assembly Bill 525, the California legislature passed an additional law, Assembly Bill 3, that is directing the CEC to develop a more in-depth and second phase port readiness strategy that will essentially build upon this map. Next slide, please. And just as ports are required for developed floating offshore wind, electric transmission lines are also required to deliver the energy to load centers. AB 525 required CEC to look at transmission opportunities and constraints to deliver energy from the suitable sea spaces. In our analysis, we found that the Central Coast has a fairly robust transmission infrastructure that could be utilized for projects in that area. So the strategic plan didn't look too closely at that area. The North Coast, where the major resource availability was identified in the strategic plan, is sort of or a bit of an energy island with little interconnection to the state's electric grid. So a lot of focus was placed on different routes and opportunities for transmission delivery from the North Coast. It found in the strategic plan that a substantial amount of development would be needed to deliver those resources on the North Coast. Following adoption of the final strategic plan and following the adoption of what's called the Integrated Resource Plan at the California Public Utilities Commission, the California Independent System Operator, who approves and manages majority of the state transmission system, approved development for 2 lines that would interconnect projects developed off of the North Coast. And it's expected in this year that the Independent System Operator will select project sponsors to build and manage those. Next slide, please. So the second statutory requirement that the CEC is currently working on is analyzing wave and tidal energy opportunities and constraints under what's called Senate Bill 605 or SB 605. Next slide, please. Under SB 605, the CEC is required to look at a lot of the same things that we did for offshore wind under AB 525. A major difference between AB 525 and SB 605 is that SB 605 is not a strategic plan for tidal and wave energy, but rather a feasibility assessment of the technology. So while offshore wind, wave, and tidal energy technologies are all considered nascent, the legislature directed us to prepare a strategic plan for offshore wind because they considered that technology to be more commercial, and in the investment interest in offshore wind was much greater at the time. And so that's kind of the big difference between those 2 reports that we'll be developing for SB 605. Next slide, please. So SB 605 is still a work in progress. To date, the CEC has prepared the first couple of reports that are required by that legislation. The first report looked at feasibility, cost, and benefits of the technology. The second report, which is currently in a public comment period, describes potential sea space for wave and tidal energy. The comment period will be closing in mid-May. A major takeaway from that report is that wave and tidal energy technologies are more suitable in shallower water than offshore wind, and therefore closer to shore, which has the potential to conflict with many other resource types. Both of the reports that are shown here on the slide will inform a final report that we're required to deliver to the governor and the legislature. And we expect to finish that report and submit those in the fall of this year. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we looked at potential sea space areas for tidal and wave energy. The maps that are shown here, where wave energy appears to have less conflict based on existing data, which is mainly on the North Coast. So that's the map on the left. Tidal energy, it appears to have less conflict within the San Francisco Bay, as shown on the map on the right. So looking up and down the entire coastline and beginning to remove areas that may have a resource potential, but have a significant conflict with a protected area or another use. Really, for tidal energy, it appears that the San Francisco Bay Area has the most potential. Also want to point out that distributed generation, or really small deployments that can power coastal loads, are possible applications for both tidal and wave energy. Also, the Senate Bill 605 report, it does not do anything to change permitting or project evaluations. Again, this is a feasibility assessment. Any projects that would be proposed would still have to go through applicable permitting processes. Next slide. So the last few slides, I'll summarize some of the key concerns that have been raised in both the AB 525 and SB 605 process. I think it's important to note that the CEC does not have a regulatory role over these offshore renewable energy technology types. For example, we aren't the lead permitting authority, and we don't have any role in authorizing these projects. So the issues that have been identified, and I'll talk about in the next few slides, come from the work we have done with other state and federal agencies, listening to tribal governments, as well as listening to an array of stakeholders. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you all are probably know much better than I do, the ocean and coastal environment is a complex space. In evaluating these technologies in that space, we have identified many considerations to take into account when planning for where the most suitable places are. An obvious and primary criteria that we use is to first identify where viable renewable resources are located. So these are wind speeds that are both spatial and temporal, as well as the wave and tidal resources. We also look at technological feasibility. So looking at things like bathymetry and other ocean conditions that make it suitable or technologically possible to develop. Once we've narrowed on those variables, we have applied in our process, and in our reports, it is described and summarized, is we begin to identify what we've called conflicts. Some of these are fairly simple to map, such as areas that are protected from development. Others take more work to identify because they require engagement and consultation with other ocean users. So fishing, working with the Coast Guard to understand how navigation plays out in the ocean. So doing that type of work is a lot more challenging than grabbing data files and GIS files that tell us where places are protected. So it takes a lot of time and attention and communication to work with other ocean users to begin to identify these conflicts. And so the next couple of slides are going to be summaries from some of those major ocean users of some of the conflicts that we've identified that I wanted to highlight today. Next slide. So shipping lanes or shipping. So shipping lanes are one of the most restricted ocean uses to siting infrastructure, because a shipping lane would be dangerous and a hazard to have any incompatibility with offshore renewable energy development. So the map that is shown here is presented to understand vessel traffic. And to do that, we used AIS data, or Automatic Identification System vessel traffic data. It shows data set counts and aggregates the number of ships off the Western US. And we use the years 2018 through 2020. We found that the highest vessel traffic takes place near San Francisco and Los Angeles. We also worked to do our best to incorporate from the U.S. Coast Guard proposed shipping lanes from the Pacific Coast Port Access Route Study, or PAC-PARS. And we built this into our evaluation because we noticed right away that the study was evaluating the safe access routes for the movement of vessel traffic to and from ports, and the establishment of voluntary shipping fairways by the U.S. Coast Guard, many of those were either overlapping or in conflict with some of the sea spaces that the AB 525 plan had identified. So the proposed shipping lanes, most are 15 nautical miles wide and pass through a lot of the sea space areas of interest that we were looking at. On the north coast, they pass through the middle of the largest sea space areas off of the Humboldt and Mendocino County area. And the map that's shown here, it shows the future sea space areas, and it shows that overlapping complex with the shipping lanes. So as we work with and as the federal government looks to any future planning for additional offshore wind off of the coast, we're going to have to take into account where to place that based on where these proposed shipping lanes land. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we've also done outreach and have done our best to work with the recreational and commercial fishing fleet in California. We have tried to do that both at the local port level and harbor level, as well as in venues like the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. And in that outreach, we have identified a number of, and this is not all of them, but these are some of the concerns that I wanted to highlight that the commercial fishing fleet has brought attention to us. So under pre-construction activities, during construction, as well as during operation of offshore wind, have all found to have an impact to the commercial recreational fisheries. And we've also learned that those impacts aren't just to the fisheries themselves, but to the economies that are connected to those fisheries. Some of those impacts may include the loss or reduction of current or future fishing grounds, the impacts to marine life and habitats, the economic loss, navigational hazards, both within the areas that the wind turbines would be deployed, also within the areas where wind turbines would be developed and constructed, damage or loss to fishing gear, increased vessel traffic, which can displace fishing operation or cause boats to have to reroute, as well as disruption to ongoing scientific surveys that are critical for supporting fisheries management. Next slide, please. So also we have done consultation and engagement with California Native American tribes. When we do this consultation and engagement, we consider both federally and non-federally recognized tribes to be tribes that we will do consultation with. So we recognize them as California Native American tribes within California. And some of the topics that they have shared with us and highlighted include the leased areas making fishing no longer open for members to access. Offshore wind may affect the oceanographic conditions of the coast, and this can negatively impact the production of these areas from a fishing perspective. And it's hard to summarize all of the concerns that California Native American tribes have, because each tribe has its own perspective, it has its own concerns, and even its own priorities regarding offshore wind. Many California Native American tribes and people have a significant connection with the Pacific Ocean and the marine habitats and species that rely on a healthy coast and ocean. So these, really vary too across active stewardship, subsistence, cultural, and definitely the commercial relationships that some have with the ocean. And then in regards to fishing, many tribes, their members depend on local fishing and harvesting of sea life to meet their needs. And many of the coastal tribes rely on marine species as part of food sovereignty programs. Tribal members rely on subsistence fishing to feed families and commercial fishing, and even some commercial fishing for financial income. Next slide, please. So just to kind of summarize, we in our reports, we've learned that stakeholder and tribal engagement is very important for steps to address impacts that are identified. The collaboration that's required with California Native American tribes, with fisheries, coastal communities, and environmental groups is absolutely critical. When it comes to the commercial and recreational fishing, as well as tribal cultural fishing, the state working with the offshore wind industry, but as well as those fisheries, has established what's called the 7C working group. That's the letter C, not the ocean C. But this is a working group that was originally required to be established by the Coastal Commission in their consistency review of BOEM's leasing actions. So under the Coastal Zone Management Act. And that's just an example of one of the steps that the state has applied. I think one thing that's important to note when talking about the importance of stakeholder and tribal engagement that we've heard is, and it's been very consistent, is that there is a lack of capacity funding to participate in these consultations and engagement. And so one of our findings in the AB 525 report is that capacity funding is critical and should be established to uplift these groups and put them in a place to be able to participate and have a seat at the table. Also, marine spatial planning, or looking at areas of least conflict at the beginning of a planning exercise or a siting exercise is a strategy for reducing or avoiding impacts. One thing that I think is important to note, and I had said it earlier, the U.S. Coast Guard's PAC-PARS process, and also just their regulation of shipping lanes, that sort of engagement has to be done very early in doing marine spatial planning and siting, because, as I said, we will tend to start where looking at where the resource is, where it can be developed, and then you need to begin to identify those conflicts. If you don't start taking off, or at least identifying some of those areas in the beginning of that process, then you're going to end up really slowing down your ability to do that marine spatial planning in a way that can reduce any of the potential conflicts later. And then also another strategy that was identified in the AB 525 report is the use of mitigation measures, but really coming up with some of those mitigation measures as early as possible. And where mitigation can't take care of or avoid an impact, the use of adaptive management and really the adaptive management strategies is something to work on early and often. I will point out that following AB 525, California agencies, specifically the Ocean Protection Council, has begun working on offshore wind monitoring guidance as a way to support some of the adaptive management strategies that may be needed. So I think that's my last slide. Yep. So I just appreciate everybody allowing us to talk about some of the work we've done in this space, and happy to answer any questions that the committee has.
Yeah, thank you very much for an excellent presentation, Eli. Much appreciated, and a lot to think about. But let's go ahead and begin with questions. So I'm not seeing. We have a few coming up. We'll start with David. We'll have quite a few before we finish, but David, then Stephen, then Tracy.
Thank you very much. Are the areas fixed are the areas relatively fixed for ORE? It seems for the offshore wind that there's the Morro Bay and the Humboldt Bay lease areas. For the hydrokinetic energy, it seems like there may not be any areas that have been selected yet or identified other than general areas that are ripe for development or consideration, you might say. To what extent are the areas limited right now? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll do my best to answer it by the technology types because I think that's the easiest way. You're right. There are two what are called wind energy areas that have been designated by the federal government. One off of Morro Bay and one off of Eureka and off of the Humboldt County line. Within those wind energy areas, there are 3 on the Central Coast that have been leased by private industry. And there are two in the wind energy areas on the North Coast that have been leased by private industry. Those areas are as fixed as they are within those lease documents. The areas that I was showing earlier are areas that the state essentially, or the CEC, but working with other state agencies as well as the federal government and through our public process. Those are areas that we identified in response to the AB 525 legislation. But the CEC doesn't have, or the state really ultimately does not have siting control of those because they are in the federal waters or federal jurisdiction. So to the extent that they're fixed in those areas would be because the federal government could take those and utilize those to identify them as wind energy areas in the future and lease those areas. But there isn't any state law that would require them to do that. So those areas I would say are not as fixed necessarily as the lease areas. The wave energy and tidal energy, those spaces that I showed earlier, that's basically our preliminary look. So we're still in a comment period on identifying those sea spaces. But what we used was the original resource evaluation where it technologically made sense, which is not in very deep waters at all compared to the waters that we talked about for offshore wind. And then we took the information that we could gather, so a lot of data, some of that information from stakeholders and tribes to identify any conflicts that would take areas essentially off the map that shouldn't be considered. But we didn't go out and create a lot of new research or a lot of new data to identify those areas. And so we hope through this public process that we have now, we'll learn more about that analysis and if it still applies. And the end of the day, that entire exercise is also that we can report on the feasibility of installing these or not installing them in a report that we have to submit to the governor and the legislature. But we don't have siting authority or the ability to say that a certain area is a go area versus a no-go area. It's mostly all to be informative.
Thank you.
Stephen?
Thank you. Thank you, Eli. Very ambitious goals there. I'm with one of the Indian tribes in Washington State that has treaty rights to fish in the ocean. And a number of the resources the tribes fish on spend time either originate in California or migrate through California. So, and I understand that the state of California has limited obligations to the tribes outside of a state, but recognizing that all of this floating offshore wind development will occur in federal waters. Have you considered working with the tribes outside of California that would could be impacted by this, and either doing it directly or through one of the federal agencies?
Not specifically. The state has participated in kind of a variety of working groups as they've evolved, I guess, with Oregon and Washington, and even sometimes Hawaii will be included in these meetings. The State Lands Commission, as well as the Coastal Commission, which are agencies that we work with, do sit on I'm not going to get it right. There's a West Coast advisory body, like a planning body. And I have heard that that's a potential space to have those sort of conversations. But from an environmental perspective, I haven't heard it discussed as much as I have things like being able to share supply chain strategies or other kind of economic avenues. So no, but I think that that's a good point. And the very first meeting that I sat in with commercial fishermen on the Central Coast, one of the fishermen attending there explained to me that fish have tails, and that all of a sudden made a lot of sense and made it even more complex because the environment is constantly moving. So I understand the question, but not something that we've done specifically.
Next question will be from Tracy, then Annette, and then Michael. Tracy.
Good afternoon. I'm Tracy Phillips. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think I heard you say that an offshore wind installation would need to be built in the port and towed out on scene. Can you tell me what's driving that requirement?
It's a technological requirement that we understand based on the information from national labs, from BOEM, as well as from the offshore wind industry. And the major driver is that the sea spaces that are currently leased, as well as the ones that were identified in the report, are minimum 20 miles or so, maybe a little bit less for the lease areas. But they have a pretty far out in terms of distance from the coastline. And when you get that far out of the coastline, the water depth is anywhere between 600 and 700 meters to as deep as 1,300 meters. So the installations for California will require a floating technology. So essentially a platform that is floating with a turbine affixed to the top of that platform. And that would require, rather than assembling and kind of staging those together at sea, to stage and integrate those in port locations. And then they would have to be towed out individually.
I mean, yeah, okay. So I understand, yeah, they have to be floating because of water depths. I was just interested to know more about why they would be towed out versus built on site. So, okay.
Yeah, I haven't, it doesn't, also, this hasn't been done yet at scale. And so we are sort of working with, like I said, the best information we have from how developers are pursuing this. But I guess their, research and development can always evolve. So I definitely don't want to go on record to say it would never happen. It's just not what has been presented to us by those companies.
Okay, thanks.
Next up, Annette.
Yes. Hi, Eli. Thank you very much. I'm Annette Von Juan, and my question is, with the goal of 25 gigawatt by 2045, and you mentioned the number of turbines based on rating, 1,000 turbines, what is the estimate on surface area to achieve that goal based on spacing of the wind turbine platforms?
Let's see, that's a good question. And I have that and I'm looking right now. Under a trying to see where I went, sorry. Okay, so under a sort of high capacity or like a high density average, that could be as much as 4,600 square miles.
Thank you. You also mentioned that you are working with working groups off of Oregon and Washington and even Hawaii. Just a question, what about Alaska?
That hasn't come into the working group. I personally don't work on the working group on a regular basis, but there is what's called the Pacific Coast Collaborative that is Washington, Oregon, and California. It is mostly built around transportation, and there has been a subgroup established to work through offshore wind issues. So it may just be because the transportation component was the driver on what was there. So I would be curious though, do you have like, is that a suggestion or kind of an observation? Is there something there we should be considering or thinking of?
So I worked in hydrokinetics, wave energy off the Oregon coast for 20 years. And it was, of course, California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. So that's why when you mentioned Hawaii, and we also did have collaboration with testing facilities off of Hawaii, but we certainly, Alaska was included. So since you didn't mention, I just thought, that's interesting.
Okay, that makes sense. I understand. Yep.
Hey Eli, how are you today? Yeah, you know me, it's Mike Conroy.
Oh, perfect. I was like, it sounded like I was supposed to know whose voice that was. Hey, Mike.
Sorry, yeah, jumped ahead of myself. No, I just first wanted to thank you for what you've done since 2016. You know, those of us in the fishing industry that have engaged with you appreciate your willingness to hear from us and I guess be on the receiving end of some of our comments. I did want to follow up on something that and I don't think that you hit on this, but I just wanted to ask you a question. You talked a little bit about distributive projects for wave and tidal rather than the commercial application for wave and tidal. In terms of different permitting processes, my understanding is that if it's a commercial project, it would have to go through FERC and go through that permitting process, which is a much lengthier one, whereas a distributive one would not have to go through FERC and would thus be going through, I guess it would be, depending upon where it's located, either state lands or the Coastal Commission. Is it envisioned that the environmental review and all of that part is going to be similar, or will they take different paths as well in terms of analyzing and then mitigating potential impacts?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way that I understand the FERC jurisdiction is based on how the project would interconnect with the electric grid. So I think, you know, technically you could have what would be a large project not interconnect with the electric grid and use it for something else. And that would probably be something that would become a use case that people haven't seen before, because most of these projects that have been proposed are interconnecting to the electric system and selling that electricity commercially. So yeah, that is where the FERC license would come in. For projects that would be distributed generation, or not connected to the electric grid, but connected to like behind the meter, connected to a customer load, wouldn't necessarily kick off, you're right, the FERC license process. And State Lands Commission, if they were the lead agency based on the project location, as opposed to somebody who's been, or an agency who's been granted that lead agency role, I'd imagine, but I can't say the guarantee that they would look toward the FERC licensing process as a potential, model to adapt what they would have to follow. Obviously, CEQA would come into play. Coastal Commission has their CEQA equivalent process for a CDP, or Commission Development Permit, or Coastal Development Permit. So I think, like, hearing that comment in our report, where we are highlighting that the distributed generation potential might be a pathway, it seems like it would be a good idea for us to consider how to describe what that permitting process would look like, as sort of a not really an alternative to the FERC licensing process, but what it would look like with those applications. So I guess I didn't think about that angle as we start discussing our findings on the distributed generation piece.
Thanks.
Brian?
Eli, Brian Penoyer here. Thanks so much for your presentation today, and just fascinating work you guys have been up to. I'm a question for you about the kind of the AB 525 areas versus the Coast Guard port access route study and the offshore fairways. My understanding of where the Coast Guard is at is that it has these offshore fairways, the 15-mile wide fairways and the port on-ramps, if you will, mapped, but would then need to go through a future process where they go through tribal consultation and NEPA consultation and decision-making before going to the International Maritime Organization, because these are offshore fairways, not something the U.S. can do. But there is this conflict with those areas that you guys have identified. And I was wondering if you can give us any insight into sort of the interaction of those two. What is it that you guys are recommending, and how do you plan to engage in that as the Coast Guard eventually goes through its further processes? Is the idea to just accept those fairways, or are you going to try to have them move them further out, or what's the current thinking on that?
I don't know if I can answer your question specifically, because I'm not sitting in that seat to respond to that. But as we have thought about it, there are some real trade-offs to consider. So if those fairways are pushed out further, you might now be increasing the number of miles that have to be traveled by vessels, which they're kind of designed to be as efficient and safe as possible. So if you start to bend on the efficiency, then that might not be the best outcome from that perspective. And then if you are looking to maybe move those closer inland, it brings in a whole new agency that I don't work for, which is the Air Resources Board. And there are some significant air resource impacts to deal with on those trade-offs. The areas that we identified, some of those are at like the extreme water depth that the offshore wind developers have communicated to us that they can develop these floating technologies in. So the further you push the offshore wind spaces or potential places out into the ocean, the less or the more challenging it probably is to develop those, which drives up their cost, which means that anybody buying that electricity, so here it would be ratepayers in California, would be paying more for that energy. And so there's some real trade-offs to have to look at. And I think it's kind of a hard conversation to have, because we know vessels work, and we know vessels will, make our economy more efficient, make our economy more connected. It's hard to go in and probably make that argument if floating offshore wind hasn't been deployed at scale yet. And it's something that we're looking to do in the future and to try to move those things around. So yeah, those are some real trade-offs to deal with. And I think that's why we wanted to just at least first identify that information.
Yeah, there does seem, this Keith Michelle, room for liaison between the Coast Guard and the states on the West Coast, because, you know, the lanes were pushed offshore earlier because of concerns about tank ships and time to drift ashore. Now we're talking about offshore wind farms potentially to windward of the shipping passage with very little room to spare. So you're making potential trade-offs on risk, and it does need collaboration between the groups. I can't say we should think of it as settled at this time.
Right.
And while I'm speaking, I do have a question, related to the 25 gigawatt target goal for 2045. That was established by the state. I guess, could you talk a little bit to what went into that decision? And when you made it, had you engaged stakeholders and tribal entities? Did you fully understand the economic and safety and negative economic and safety impacts? And are you going to revisit that, or is that just set, the 25 gigawatt capacity?
Yeah. So the requirement to establish a goal was a requirement of the legislation that was passed by the California legislature. So that was within the bill. The bill didn't set those numbers, though. It directed the CEC to consider 12 or 13 different factors, and to prepare a report summarizing our analysis of those factors, and then setting up that goal using those. The purpose of the goal is just for developing the plan that we developed. The goal is not a hard target for procuring those resources. It is not built into the reliability planning of the state in the future. It was really to set a goal to do the plan around. I know that the goals are described in that report as aspirational. So they were designed to be larger in order to look at the full suite of considerations that would be taken into account. It was as much a technical process as it became a political process when we went through establishing those goals. I would say it's probably better to start with looking at your available sea space and then coming up with where your goals are. But the way that the legislation was designed had us setting a goal and then sort of going out and verifying or finding sea space to meet those. And I think that just gets back to one of the recommendations that we found, which is doing that spatial planning first and moving on from there is really an important way to go about it and do it. So yeah, some of it was within our hands, and then some of it was outside of our hands because we were being directed to do that. And I think if I recall, the first version of that bill, when it was introduced before it started going through committees, that bill did have a goal built into it. And I don't remember the year that it was setting it for, but it was 10 gigawatts by a year. I don't remember if it was before 2045 or around there. And so the number sort of climbed as our process went through.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and a good explanation. Can you make that report available to us? It would be an interesting read for a number of us. Is there
Should I follow up with an email?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll provide that all the reports that sort of went into the big final report, but I'll provide that so you can see those like interim reports that were developed that eventually inform the larger report. So there's a lot of reading material there, but the goal setting report, I'll make sure to highlight that one.
Excellent. So Maddie will get in touch with you from the staff here and then you can send it back to her. Thank
Sure.
you.
Yeah.
Could I just ask, how far does the current lease areas go towards that goal of 25 gigawatts?
So yeah, that's a good question. So the legislation actually directed us to do a 2030 goal and a 2045 goal. I usually just kind of focus on that 2045 goal because it's the larger number. But the legislation did say the first areas you'll identify to count towards your 2030 goal should be these lease areas. And so we set a goal of 2 to 5 gigawatts by 2030. And the lease areas are probably anywhere between 5 gigawatts upwards of 10, depending on the site conditions of each of the lease areas. So developers are currently in the process to survey and understand the development potential there. And it won't be until after they've assessed those that they'll actually know the number of turbines that they'll be able to place in each one, which would get us to that capacity estimate.
Okay, any further questions? Brian, do you have one? Yeah.
Hey, Eli, Brian Penoyer again. You mentioned a couple of times the sort of lesson learned about early marine geospatial planning, and that just puts me in mind similar to the if you have thoughts you'd like to gather and maybe send in an email. The current national framework, federal framework for geospatial planning was created by a presidential executive order on ocean policy. And it's governed the way it's governed, and it's kind of generated the series of interagency processes that we have today. I wonder if you have any particular, and feel free to respond to us later if you'd like to think this through. But I'd really I'd welcome your thoughts about like the adequacy of that executive order or the way it is today. In other words, what you observed here off of the West Coast, is that related to agencies just getting a late start? Or is it more fundamental to the process that's laid out in the executive order? What would you recommend changing in that if you could?
Brian, do you know the executive order number, or is there a way I can reference that?
Strangely, I do know that. Sorry.
No, that's good.
Maybe a bit more than 2. Yep, there it is. Okay, so the I'm sorry, the EO number is writing 13840 is June of 2018. And of course, those things do get updated and replaced. So it may be replaced by a new one, but it's the executive order on ocean policy.
Okay.
And if you'd prefer, Eli, you can certainly come back to us by email with your comments on that one.
Yeah, I think that's one I would definitely want to confer with our other state agencies that we work with closely in this space. So definitely Coastal Commission, State Lands, Ocean Protection Council.
Next up is Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Eli. And I just wanted to throw a nod for you all in your approach in the SB 605 draft consultants report for identifying suitable sea space. I think you alluded to this and the difference that that you guys chose to use when, the AB 525 document drew circles on a map. This one sort of went through and did the beginning of the process and looked at it holistically and said, for whoever the intended beneficiary or reader of this is, these are the areas, these are potential constraints. If you're a project proponent and intend to look at proposing a project in these areas, these are the considerations. So I understand the constraints that were placed on you by the language of the legislation itself, but just very much appreciate the approach that was taken for this effort, for this SB 605 effort. And I hope that as we start to look at that, if we get into the nuanced part of those, we can certainly highlight that and sort of lobby for that approach versus the other. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I can't take any credit, but my colleague Danielle Mullaney, who is actually was helping me with my slides and advancing those slides, is the lead for that report, and definitely was the critical thinker and problem solver on how to approach that legislation. So I know she's on and listening.
All right, very good. Any further questions from the committee or any others? All right, hearing none. Thank you very much, Eli. Very informative. We'll certainly be back in touch with you as we further gather data. Thanks again from the whole committee.
Yep, thank you, and good luck with your research and your report. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. That concludes our open session for today. We will start up again in open session tomorrow at 8:45 Pacific time with presentations on from the Port of Long Beach, Pacific Merchant Shipping Association, and Moffett and Nichols on more on activity of developing offshore renewable energy structures here on the West Coast and shipping activity on the West Coast. So with that, I will say thank you, unless Maddie has something to say now that she's spotlighted. All right, and for committee members, we do have a little bit of closed session time. So those that are online, if we can jump back to the closed committee link, and we'll just do some wrap up comments before we end for the day for committee members.